Hi everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we are going to be discussing the Moors and the Indians, and this includes the Indians in the East and the Indians in the West. This is a world tour. We are going to be looking at a few etymologies. We're also going to be looking at some dynamics in scripture, and also we have a bonus discussion related to Star Wars. So yes, we're going to tie all of this together. We're going to do it very quickly. This was not planned as a part of the winding down. This is a result of a comment that just came in recently. And so we're not going to go in depth in terms of the analysis, but there will be some information provided, and you can continue on and do a little bit more exploration on the topics as you see fit. If this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. Okay, so here is the comment that led to this discussion, and it's from a commenter, Hannibal, and of all names, and it is a quote related to the Mexican War. And you can take some time to read this. What happened was, after seeing the comment, some research was done to track down this comment and the context of the comment. And what was uncovered was a little bit more information related to this particular comment. And so we're going to look at a newspaper clipping so that you can see a little bit more related to this comment and this Mexican border and this commentary related to the Moorish people in relation to Mexico. Now, back in 1847, there was an article in the National Intelligencer, and so this article actually relates to the comment that the commenter provided, and so we're going to look a little bit deeper at what was going on and what this comment is related to, but most importantly, what we're going to be looking at is the issues related to identity in terms of Moorish and Mauritania and the Indians, and this is all related to Mexico. Okay, so here is the article, and it's a discussion related to the true boundary between what would be known now as the United States and Mexico. And so you can see the arrow pointing there to true boundary, and it mentions the two rivers, and one of those is actually the Rio Grande. And so this is in 1845, and it's talking about the boundary that is in the desert, basically, in relation to these two rivers. And as the article continues, you see that they are discussing this boundary between the United States and Mexico. And part of the boundary discussion revolves around the idea of race. And there is a delineation in terms of the races that they believe belong in the different spaces. And so it's indicated that what would be considered the United States, that belongs to the Anglo-Saxons, the Anglo-Saxon race, and then what would be considered Mexico belongs to the Mauritanian races. And it's noted that it says races, and so that's very interesting. And then there's more specification related to the relationship between the Moorish people and what is known as their Indian associates. And so they are definitely making a distinction between the Moorish people and the Indian people, but they are also saying that this is a very close association. So we're going to look at what associate actually means in this context. Another thing that's noteworthy is if you look down at the bottom, there is this notation related to the spirit of conquest that rages in the people, and that as long as the races are separated, everything should be peaceful. But if the races mix between these two groups, then there will be a need for conquest, a conquering, if not extinguishing of one race or the other. Okay, so let's just quickly look at a few maps from that time period. And so here are some maps so you can see the different possessions. And you can see Mexico is a huge territory, actually. And you can see the other territories around North America on the map. So you can see Oregon country, you can see unorganized territory, you can see the different spaces over to the right, which would be the southeast area, and then you have the northeast area. And here's another map so you can see a little bit closer what's going on in terms of that eastern side. So that would be on the right side of the screen. And this is another map so you can see the territorial growth. And again, you can see Mexico has a huge chunk. And when you think about it, remember that the Spanish also owned a lot of the land that you see in red. So that land was also owned by the Spanish. It's interesting that there is a distinction between Moorish and Spanish, Mauritania and Spanish. And so they are not indicating that the individuals are Spanish. They are specifically saying Mauritanian, which is very interesting because when you think of Mexico, you don't historically think of Mauritania. You tend to think of Spain. Okay, so now let's just revisit this dynamic related to associates. So this is some very interesting language. So they are definitely specifying that there is a difference between the Moorish people and the Indians, but they are also insinuating that there is a very close relationship between the Moorish people and the Indians. And so we're going to look at this word associate so that we get a clear picture of what is being stated here in terms of that relationship. Okay, so now let's look at the Indian relationship status in relation to the Moors according to those in the north. And so clearly they were distinguishing between the Moorish individuals and the Indian individuals. But one thing that was noted is that the Indian people were seen as subordinate in this dynamic, and also identified as the associates of the Moorish people. And so there was not a delineation of the Indian people actually being the owners of the land. It was given to the Moorish people in the eyes of the Anglo-Saxons. And so what you have here is this dynamic whereby the Indians are understood as partners or colleagues, companions, comrades, and also perhaps seen as junior members of this confederacy between the Moors and the Indians. Now let's just look a little bit more at this idea related to this relationship status. And so again, you have closely connected, and so they are identifying the Indians as closely connected with the Moorish individuals, but also again having that secondary or subordinate status, but again very closely related. Now we are going to make a trip back over east to the other Indians. And one thing we've talked about this before is this relationship between India and Africa. And this also applies with the Moors and the Mandi. So you actually have a place in India, Moor Mandi. And you can see a little bit more information here related to MAURS Mandi, and it is a city and a municipal council in the Indian state of Punjab. And you'll also notice if you look down an interesting notation in relation to Mansa city. So again, you have this interesting relationship between India, Africa, and the Americas. Now, another thing that's important to note is that these people in India have been there for a very long time, since antiquity. And so this is not a new group of people. And so what is also interesting to note is that when the Moors came to the Americas, and when Columbus came to the Americas, and it was identified as the Indies, and then the people were called Indian. It's very interesting because what you might have had going on was that the Moors were simply naming the place after themselves and not really thinking that it was India, but just attributing that place name to the new place. And so there was a lot of that going on with having the old world and the new world. And this may have simply been the Moors actually naming the land space after themselves and then naming the people after themselves. Now, we are just going to look at a few observations related to the history of the Moors. And these are some observations that will lead to some other avenues of research if you are interested in researching any of this any further. So, one of the things that is noted is that this is a highly nomadic group of people. Historically, they have just been all over the place. And what has also been noted is that there is a diaspora in terms of that male Y haplogroup, which also involves a significant amount of ethnic cleansing in all of the places that they have migrated to. And so you have a heavy presence of this DNA in the East Indies to the West Indies. You have presence of this DNA East Indies and in Central Africa. You also have this migration out of Asia, East Indies into Europe. You also have a migration from East Indies into America. And one commenter noted that America was also noted as or called India Superior in the 1500s. And so when there was that migration, there was again that renaming of things. Another thing that is noteworthy, and it's not clear exactly where it's all coming from, but wherever there have been Moorish people, there has been significant colorism and phenotype caste systems. And so there has been a tradition of that. And so if you just sort of follow along wherever the Moors have migrated to, there has been this dynamic of colorism. Okay, so another area of research that you might want to follow if you are interested in DNA and ancestry is the dynamic related to the R haplogroup for males. You might want to explore this a little bit more. There's a lot of talk about the R1b. However, you might want to look at the entire R complex and the migration of that DNA. So the migration of the R1a and the R1b. And you see there is the belief that it's related again to Anatolia. And so you might want to trace that and see the relationship between that and the migration of individuals identifying as Moorish for both the R1A and the R1B. Now, when looking at this dynamic related to the R, a number of things come up in terms of thinking. You have this dynamic where they are believed to have originated in North Asia, and also this dynamic of identifying them as perhaps mammoth hunters. And if you are aware of what a mammoth is, it's a member of an extinct group of elephants. But the other important thing is they are enormous in terms of size. And so this idea of a tribe hunting this mammoth animal is a very interesting dynamic with this R, the R1A, R1B. It's a very interesting dynamic. And what it leads to is the question of the size of these individuals. And so they are hunting this enormous animal in this theory. And the theory then should go that they must have also been enormous in terms of humans. Now, if you recall from previous discussions, we talked about the fact that the UK is now starting to admit that brown people have been in Europe for a very long time, and this includes individuals from Africa and India. And one of the other things that you might want to make note of in terms of this chasing down this woolly mammoth is that there is an Irish tradition that tells of this giant race of Africans headed by this king, and he had a group of priests known as Fomorians. And these individuals are identified in this Irish narrative as gloomy sea giants, and they are thought to have brought their skills from Africa via Spain. And there's also the notation that the original Celtic priesthood was identified as quote unquote black. And so there's this belief that these individuals migrated out of what would be the Iberian Peninsula area and migrated into the area of the Isles. And so this again is a very interesting dynamic and a very interesting oral tradition, this idea of giants, these African giants that migrated into that area. And so this Irish narrative leads to a deconstruction of that word Mauritania. And so it's very interesting that there is this narrative coming out of Ireland related to these giants. What's also interesting is the name Mauritania. And so if you separate out the Mari and the Tania, you have an interesting dynamic. So you have the Moors and then you have the Tania. And Tania is a girl's name of Russian and Greek origin, and it means giant. And so you also have Titania, which means land of giants. And so you have this relationship between Mari and Tania coming together, suggesting that the Mari perhaps were giants. Now, this is where the discussion takes an interesting turn in terms of analysis. Now, there is also another delineation of giant, and it is in scripture. And so the name for giant is Anak, and so also spelled phonetically as Anaki. And so there are some other words that relate to this. And so you have the Anakim, and also this relates to Star Wars and Anakin. And so you can see here additional information related to this. The definition is neck, a giant people. And you can also see additional information down below. And then you can see notations related to where this name appears in scripture and what it's related to. And so you see Anak, but then you see the full name of Anakim and the Anakims, meaning the people. And of course, another way to pronounce that is the Anakim. And so you have the Anaki and the Anakim. And here is additional discussion in Strong's Concordance related to Anakim. And you can see it comes from Anak again, or the Anaki. And that's Anakite or Anaki. And then you also see Anakim again. And you see additional notations as to where you can find this in scripture. And so you see Deuteronomy and Joshua. And here are some additional notations, and there is a focus on the individuals having a very long neck and being a giant race of people. And again, off to the right, you can see notations related to where you can find discussions in scripture. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, this is Anakin, and George Lucas borrowed heavily from scripture in terms of his depictions and some of the storylines in Star Wars. And one of the dynamics, of course, that was borrowed was the name Anakin, which of course relates back to Anak, Anakim. And so you see Anakin when he was a little boy all the way through adulthood. And it's a spoiler if you're not familiar with Star Wars, but Anakin is actually Darth Vader. Vader. Now, if you recall, Darth Vader is extremely tall. He's basically a giant and he towers over everyone. And what's interesting is that this idea of Anak ties to this idea of Nephilim, also Nephil. And Nephilim, if you recall, is related to giant also. So you have Anak and giant, and you have Nephilim and giant. And this name actually is attributed to two people. One person who's identified as existing before the flood in terms of scripture, and then one person with this name existing after the flood. And so you can also see off to the right instances when you can see this in scripture. So you see identification in Genesis and also Numbers. And if you look over to the right and then toward the middle, you see the Nephilim, sons of Anak. And so like father, like son. And here you can see an additional notation related to this name, and you see Nephal also meaning giant, Nephil, and also a feller, a bully or tyrant, a giant. Okay, so here you can see an extension of this definition related to Nephal, and it means to fall. And this also goes back to, again, Genesis in scripture. So it means to fall and to lie. And you see another notation related to the deconstruction of this word and this Anak slash Nephi. And you see that it also means to scatter or to expand. Now, what's interesting is that there are a couple of geographic spaces that are named in relation to these names, Anak and Nephi or Nephi. And so you have a mountain in Ireland, and you can see a depiction of that here. And then there's something a little closer to home in terms of the United States. Okay, so closer to home, you see Nephi or Nephi in Utah. There is an entire city, and you can also see a mountain in the background there. Another thing to note in terms of Utah is that there is a Moab desert in Utah. And so there appears to be, some naming in terms of geographic spaces related to scripture and also related to a people. And connecting the dots further, we have a connection between Nephi and Anak and Lot. And so you can see here that you have a delineation for this name meaning, and it translates into a lot and cast, and also cast down, divided by lot. Again, this is tracing right back to Lot again, and of course you know that Lot is tied into the dynamic related to Moab. Okay, so now we have gone around the world with the MAURS, and we've looked at the relationship between the MAURS and the Indians in both the East and the West. We've looked at a few etymologies, we've looked at some scripture, and we've also looked at Star Wars. And so there are a lot of dots that are connecting and areas of additional research that you might want to do on your own related to any of these topics. There is a lot to cover there. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care.